Listening to classic American music on FM 89.3 KPCC from the great Artie Shaw, George and Ira Gershwin composition. Someone to Watch Over Me. We heard a song made famous by the original Gramercy Five, Summit Ridge Drive, and an original composition by Artie, Lyric, with the Sextet in New York, March of 1954. Hank Jones on piano, Tal Farlow guitar, Joe Rowland on vibes, Tommy Potter on bass, and Irv Kluger on drums. This Wednesday morning, we welcome Artie Shaw to the studios here at KPCC FM as we listen to the last recordings of the King of the Clarinet with his New York Sextet and Hollywood Quintet, recorded some 40 years ago and then put away in a vault. This is still some of the most exciting jazz available. Top-notch musicians with the intense and subtle sensitivity needed to create music with meaning, Artie Shaw's trademark. After these final studio dates, he toured Australia and then quit the business. A time for change and a new beginning, a respite from the chaos that the music industry had become. Artie began writing and has been doing so ever since. Artie, it's great to have you with us. A pleasant good morning to you.
Thank you, Freddie. It's nice to be here. Took me a while to find it, but here we are.
The last recordings, which you produced over 40 years ago and placed in a vault, are now able to be savored by Americans now, 40 years later. Why did you decide to release them finally?
Well, it wasn't a question of my deciding. It was a question of somebody else deciding they thought they might find an audience. When I made these records, nobody questioned the quality of the music. But most of the recording people at that time, Columbia, a guy like John Hammond, who had discovered Bob Dylan, he had a lot of credentials with Columbia Records or CBS, and Tio Macero, who used to do all the production of the Miles Davis records. They wanted to do these records, but Columbia, in their wisdom, and they may have been right, who knows, decided there was no audience for that at that time. And people say, why did you quit? On the Larry King show, for example, they asked me that, why'd you quit? I named every band leader of that period who was in the same league, more or less, or in the same ballpark, and I said, they're all dead. And here I am, alive, so I must have done something right. The business was a killer. You know, you had to, at least if you were following an inner drive for a compulsion, really, for perfection, which is a curse of mine. I can't do it any other way. I'm not claiming it's good. I wish I didn't have that. Then life would have been easier. If I could have had Lawrence Welk's mentality, I'd have been worth $120 million today. But I couldn't do that. And so I had to do what I had to do. And, the difference between an artist and an entertainer, without making any judgments as to which is better or which is more useful, is that the entertainer is out there to please Sam and Helen and Mary and Joe. And if he does, his mission is accomplished. The artist is out there primarily the operative word, to please himself. And if he doesn't matter who likes it. He hopes they'll like what he does, but the classic case, of course, is Van Gogh, who kept painting and painting and painting, and in his entire lifetime got $35 for 2 paintings. 2, not for 1, 35. And his brother was an art dealer. Nobody wanted to look or think about his painting. But here we are now, paying $50 to $80 million for one. If he'd got that, he must be spinning in his grave, the poor man.
I was going to say he lost an ear in the deal, too.
Pardon?
He lost an ear in the deal, too.
Well, maybe I lost an ear. I'd have been okay.
You recorded on both coasts. What was the reason for this? You brought the band to Vegas and then came out to Hollywood to record?
Well, no. You see, you have to travel around to keep these men, and you got to pay people. One of the reasons you quit is because I can't wait 40 years for a payday. The men get to be old men with beards and dead by that time. So you have to pay these men every week, and they are fine musicians, and I respected them and paid them the best salary I could get, or they could get. And, if you don't keep working, so what we had to do is work in New York and then worked in Vegas and worked in Cleveland or in Boston or wherever they'd pay us. And finally we got out to the coast and I'd about had it, and by that time it was time for me to start writing. As I've said over and over, I didn't stop playing, I started writing. It's something I'd been doing for some 40 years before then. A new book of mine has just come out, not just a couple of years ago, called The Best of Intentions. Half of those stories were written 45 years before that, before I quit music. So I was always living this dual existence.
How many books have you written?
Well, I've published 3. I've written about 6. I've got another one I've been working on for almost 15 years.
Wow.
It'll get out one of these days when I'm finished with it. Somebody once said a work of art is never finished, it's abandoned. One of these days I'll abandon it.
A thing happened to you. Tal Farlow quit your band, and he was such an amazing guitarist. Tal Farlow.
It wasn't that Tal quit. We had a setup where when Tal played, he was accompanied by vibes. Piano was not there.
Right.
If you listen carefully, it was very thinly orchestrated, very much like chamber music. And so at a certain point, when we got to Vegas, we were playing in a place where there was no room for the vibes. And so Tal had decided he'd about had enough of that anyway, and Joe couldn't come because I couldn't put the vibes on his stand, so I hired a guy named Joe Puma who did the guitar. So a few of those records you'll hear don't have vibes at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yesterday's was one, Just Too Marvelous, Supposing, a few of those. But we just did them off the tops of our heads.
Is that an example of music being transparent? You speak about the transparency of music, being able to...
Well, being able to see right through it to the bottom of it. A long time ago, I decided, when I had my big band, that the only way you could get a record that would make a hit, that would get a lot of audience, sell a lot of copies, which is the basic aim, of course. When you're running a big band, you have a big salary, big nut to meet every week. Plus lawyers, plus agents, plus transportation. It's tremendous. You're running a one-man show with a lot of help. And I decided that the thing to do is make a record, make arrangements so transparent that you could see right down to the bottom of them, like looking through clear water at the bottom of a clear lake.
Mm-hmm.
And Begin the Beginning was the first example of that particular thing. Looking back in the glare of 2020 hindsight, I can see why it was a hit. I didn't expect it, but I can see now why it was, because it was brand new. At that time, jazz, as they call it, I hate that word, but anyway, jazz was really a series of riffs. Basically, the rhythm impulse was what kept going, the jitterbugs for them to jump up and down. I decided that I would see if we could do that same kind of swinging a ballad. And we took Begin the Beginning, which was, of course, a very unusual tune. In those days, songs were, 16 bars, as most of them are today. A, B, A, C, or A, B, A, B, A, or A, B, D, B, C, whatever. And that one was a 58-bar chorus, or 54, I've forgotten. And we did one record of it, but gave it the same beat as you would a jazz tune.
Mm-hmm.
Cole Porter was crazy about it. I'm doing a new CD now, in which you have another tune. He heard the recording of My Heart Belongs to Daddy. He said it was the best record of it he ever heard in his life. And when I shook hands with him when I first met him on Begin the Beginning, after that, he said he was happy to meet his collaborator. I asked him if that went for royalties, and he smiled that pleasant smile and said, no, it did not.
No money. Artie Shaw joins us here on FM 89.3 KPCC, Pasadena, Los Angeles, Orange County. You like layering the piano in vibes, is that, or the guitar in vibes?
I'm sorry, what? Say?
The layering of instruments now, I'm thinking...
There's only one record, actually, in which I did more or less what I had in mind when I first put the group together. After doing it a couple of times, I decided that was okay for one. It's a record called Tenderly, where we hit a kind of blend between clarinet, guitar, vibraphone, and piano. And the melody was played that way. But I decided it was a rather limiting thing, and I've never liked limiting things. I'd like things where you're wide open and you can do spontaneously stuff that'll surprise you yourself.
Mm-hmm.
If music doesn't have an element of surprise in it, as far as I'm concerned, it's not worth listening to. I mean surprise for the listener, not for the listener, but for the player himself.
Sure.
You have to play a note as if you just discovered it.
So there was no written music for these sessions at all?
No, we would rehearse. I would start a framework. Sometimes I would write a framework of the melody of the tune, like lyric you mentioned. Well, I wrote the melody and the chord structure. And we went over it a few times and threw the paper away and went on. From there on in, it grew and evolved into whatever it was. That was true of everything.
Right. No repetition or falling into formula.
No, we did about 200 pieces without a note written.
Mm-hmm. It seems amazing to me that most of these were first or second takes.
Well, some. Some. Crush on You was about 22 takes. I never had such a problem as I did with that one. I don't know why. I think I wanted something so pellucid, if that's the word, crystal clear and simple and intimate, that it was very difficult to maintain that. And you'd started and it didn't quite make it, and finally we hit one that I got squeezed by. I heard it later and I wondered, why did it take 22 to do that? But it did. Mostly, you're right. We played enough on the jobs, so that by the time we got to the studio, leave a little room for a little improvisation, for a little surprise here and there. I don't know if you noticed it, but I don't think the average listener does. But if you hear "Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered," which is it's a song, very well-known song, the last 8 bars after I come back in again on the bridge, the last 8 bars, I hit something I had not intended to do, and none of us knew where I was going to go. I didn't know. I was playing, I suddenly found myself playing "The Song Is You." And after about 4 bars of it, I finally found my way back to "Bewitched." I didn't realize, see, there's what I mean by discovery. I had discovered that "The Song Is You" by Kern is the same chord structure as "Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered" up to a point. But you fall into these things, and that's when it's exciting,
I've often admired you for your use of quotes in solos. I hear so many different songs throughout an improvisational piece of yours, little quotes of Ellington. I hear all kinds of things.
Yeah, rockin' and rhythm.
Does that come naturally to you?
Well, yeah, you're playing along and you want to amuse yourself too. Jazz should have some there's a big difference between solemn and serious.
Right.
I mean, we were serious, but we weren't solemn. We occasionally have fun. And that comes through. Like, for example, and there's a sort of mambo piece I wrote called "Stop and Go Mambo." Occasionally we made fun of it. We even played the Laurel and Hardy theme song at one point, which was, pretty silly music. Just happened, the piano did something, and I heard something, and all of a sudden we're playing the Laurel and Hardy theme song. It's just a joke,
You want to hear that?
Oh, I don't care. I've heard enough of it, but maybe the audience will like to hear it.
I think we should. Artie Shaw will be right back. We're going to turn to the last recordings of Artie Shaw, the Stop and Go Mambo, classic American music on KPCC.
I do that. Here it comes now. Now listen to the piano. Artie.
I heard it.
Well, you see what I mean? In strictly purist jazz circles, that would be frowned upon.
Right.
They insist on getting very serious about it, and the trouble is they mistake serious for solemn. Solemn is a bore. Serious includes humor. There's some very serious humor around, and that, I hope, qualifies for that. Then, incidentally, Adam, whether you notice it, no, you wouldn't notice it. Most people won't. The last chord of that, I played a chord there that very few people could possibly identify as what Scriabin called the mystic chord. Now, you know, that has very little to do with what we call jazz. But if you're going to play what I'd prefer to call American informal music, meaning as opposed to European formal music, because Europe has informal music too. It's called the fado, it's called flamenco. There's all kinds of informal music. But this is American, and America has its own flavor, as you know. So I prefer my own self to inject any possible thing that might fit, just as any good composer in Europe would be, as Debussy was or Ravel was. They caught on to the idea that jazz had some meaning, and they would infuse their playing and their writing with jazz. It happened. Now, you know, the other thing, you go back far enough, you'll find that Bach swings, Mozart swings. A lot of Beethoven's heavy stuff doesn't. But when Beethoven writes in his improvisatory mood, he swings too. Swing has nothing to do with jazz alone. I hate the word to begin with. I hate language. You know, trouble with language in general is like trying to talk about painting to a blind man. If you don't listen to the music, you're not going to know what anybody's talking about anyway.
So there should not be categories in music, I don't think.
Well, the trouble is we have categories because there are so many phenomena we're dealing with in our daily lives that we have to pigeonhole them in order to be able to deal with life at all.
Right, exactly.
But, you know, generalities are never true. Specifics are the only things that are true. I had a symposium out at Cal Lutheran College one day with some very fine musicians. I mean, people like Mel Powell and Lalo Schifrin and a guy named John Carter, who's dead now. But anyway, we talked about the very fact that the word jazz is a misnomer. It was once valid. When Bunk Johnson and Bessie Smith were playing, they would jazz up a tune, or they were playing the blues, which were jazz. But today the word has become totally supernumerary. Jazz has become too complex. It's too sophisticated an art form. Some of it is almost what's the word, unperceptive to the average public. First of all, to listen to a good jazz player play a tune, A, you have to know the tune. B, you have to know its construction. Then you have to know its chord structure, and you have to see the ingenuity with which the performer is changing and altering that. Art Tatum, a perfect example of that. Changing chords, changing rhythms, changing tempo. Well, you got to know a lot to hear that. Most people are just responding to the top line of it, so to speak. Mm-hmm. They're hearing it and responding, and that's fine. God love them. You need audiences. If they're not there, you're not getting paid. And if you're not getting paid, you can't do it.
Right.
So that's the way it is.
I would say make the audience smile. You'll probably sell more records, too, I would think.
Well, you hope. I don't know if they do or don't. As I say, some of them think, well, what is he doing? That's not pure jazz. Of course it isn't. Pure is terrible.
Right.
Pures can get very boring.
We just heard this Stop and Go Mambo featuring Irv Kluger on the drums. I love what he's doing on that song. It just kind of...
Yeah, well, he was an excellent drummer. Very underrated.
Uh-huh.
Tommy Potter, another one. He was very underrated, and he's, as somebody said, he's like a rock under everything. But, you do the best you can with the material at hand, which was an epitaph I gave Who's Who on me when I got to be 75. I recently changed it, by the way.
You did?
Yeah, I made it much more refined. It's down to a very simple thing. 3 syllables. Go away.
Don't bother. Artie Shaw joins us here on FM 89.3 KPCC. It's good to see you, Artie.
Well, nice to be here. Thanks.
Yeah. You're playing so softly on these tracks. I can hear the clarinet keys clicking so much. It must have been a very relaxed and obviously nurturing musical environment.
Well, relaxed is one way, but on the other hand, it's very tense, because to play that quietly, first of all, the reason I did it imparts a certain intimacy to the instrument. It gives the instrument a sound that you cannot get when you're playing at real, normal volume. And on certain tunes, like, for example, I mentioned You Got a Crush on You. I didn't mention one called, what's the one? Don't Take Your Love Away From Me, which is almost, if I have a favorite, it's almost the best one on the whole bunch. It's so quiet that you can actually hear the keys, because I was playing so close to the mic and at such a low volume that I barely got the reed to vibrate. And if it doesn't vibrate, you got no sound. So I had to keep the breath control extremely low, and in doing so, that's tense. You're on the edge of a note breaking. Right. In a tune called Imagination, a couple of places, the note almost didn't come out. But it did. It managed to come out somehow. Another one was Yesterday's. Those are very, very difficult to do. But, they came out. It's done.
Mm-hmm. What is it about a ballad and you?
Well, ballads are what music is about, finally. There's a good little story about Lester Young. Lester was a consummate musician. I had a lot of fun with him. I enjoyed him, and we liked each other's playing. We had a lot of the same attitudes toward music. And the story goes that he was playing jazz at the Philharmonic, that thing. He used to call it the Plantation, the white man's plantation.
Norman Granz produced?
Yeah, that thing. Norman Granz is not one of my favorite people. Neither was he one of theirs. But anyway, there was Lester playing that, and he was very bored with that kind of showbiz attitude. And at one point, Sonny Stitt, who was a formidable technician, broke up the show. He got playing so fast, so many things, that the audience responded to that. As I say, they hear the top line. And so after the show, they were all in the bus, and Sonny was still on a high. The adrenaline was pumping, and he was running up and down the aisle of the bus playing. And he got to Lester lying there with his pork pie hat over his head, trying to get a little sleep and forget the disgusting evening that he'd just been through. And Sonny blew a cascade of notes into Lester's ear and stopped. And Lester looked up at him and said, "That was nice, Lady Stitt. Now sing me a song." Right. Boy, that says a lot. And it's true that, at jazz tempos, at up tempos, you play what comes naturally and so on. But at a ballad, you can think. And while you're thinking, you come up with various new approaches to what that song is about. Some of them can be surprising to you.
Mm-hmm. Like you say, the lyric. You have to know the lyric, you have to know the song.
Well, you have to know the song. I'm not a lyric man. I don't care about the lyrics. I find the lyrics fatuous, mostly. Mm-hmm. Gibraltar will crumble, the Rockies will tumble, or whatever it is, and our love is here to stay. You can't get much more silly than that. But they're good lyrics. He was a very skilled guy, Ira Gershwin was.
Mm-hmm.
And Porter was remarkable. A lyric like, it's a silly song, My Heart Belongs to Daddy, but the lyric on that is quite remarkable. You know, he was a very satiric man.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't think about lyrics. I thought of the construction of the tune and what could be done. A tune like, it wasn't ever a big hit, Don't Take Your Love From Me. I think I made one of the best records of it I've ever made.
We're gonna hear that in just a few seconds.
Oh, good. Well, that's one I can really like. As I say, that's transparent. You can really look down to the bottom of that one. That's chamber music. It's not jazz.
This music was released some 40 years after the fact. The music, of course, standing the test of time, and some of the finest music I've heard. Do you think that this music, or actually, I was going to ask you, what is the secret? Do you think of the music's longevity? Why is it now being released and being received so well?
Well, it's not too strange. It doesn't seem strange to me. We're just beginning to catch up to what, as I said, Van Gogh did. We've just caught up with him, and he died quite a number of years ago, a lonely suicide. And same thing applies. I don't like to make allusions to painting. Let's talk about music. Edgar Varese is hardly understood. Bartók is now beginning to be played. Stravinsky took a long time before Sacre de Printemps. And you know, we all know that anecdote about when it was first played, they threw cabbages and whatnot at the conductor, Montour. Well, you know, I asked myself, who takes cabbages to a concert? So that had to be fomented. There was a clique who said this is rotten music. Well, they've eaten their words. And, you know, a guy like Whitney Balliet, who's a fine music critic, he writes beautifully, but his criticism is sometimes a little on the prejudice side. Well, he wrote a criticism of Catch-22 that is classic. He said this is like the kind of humor little kids do when the parents leave. And look at Catch-22, it's become part of the language. So a lot of critics have to, over a period of time, they begin to eat their words. And I think that happens with music as well.
Mm-hmm. Let's get to the music. Speaking of which, this is Artie Shaw and something we were just talking about, Don't Take Your Love From Me. More last recordings, the final sessions of Artie Shaw, all compositions arranged by Artie and produced by Artie. And this is Don't Take Your Love From Me, classic American music on KPCC. Classic American music only on FM 89.3, KPCC, Pasadena, Los Angeles.
Now the clarinet comes back in on the bridge. And listen. Now here comes the thing. Total surprise. Back to the... Now, what happened in the studio at that point, when I hit into that... The song is you.
Right.
The guys looked at me not quite sure whether they should follow me into the rest of that or not, because I was surprised, they were surprised, and I finally found my way back to Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered. So, with apologies to Kern and Rogers, the tunes blended, you see.
Very much so.
But the kind of thing you don't expect, and what I liked about these records was just that there was absolutely no pandering to public taste on these things. We did what we felt was right musically, and 40 or 50 years later, we're vindicated. Speaking of that, anything that goes 40 or 50 years beyond its functional place that it was supposed to be in has a good chance of what we call musical immortality. I wrote a concerto for clarinet back in, not really a concerto, it's more a fantasia, but that is now being recorded by symphony orchestras and with symphony clarinet players all over the world. So, you know, if something has validity, if it's musically valid, it has a chance of staying forever. Mm-hmm. If you've had music written that you wrote 50 years ago and is still being played and more, then you have to say, okay, it'll probably be played 100 years from now. I ain't going to be around. At least I don't expect to be. I'm aiming at it, but I doubt it.
Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered from Artie Shaw, the last recordings on Music Masters, Rogers and Hart, Gem. And in just a little bit, we're going to hear The Chaser, another original from Artie Shaw, who joins us in studio here on KPCC. Let's talk about Hank Jones.
Well, Hank is a nice guy to talk about. I had a great musical rapport with him, and with the others, of course. But Hank sort of epitomized what I had in mind for piano. He was probably one of the most underrated people in the country on his instrument. He's since gone on to become, at least a jazz star. But I ran into him not too long ago at Dizzy's 75th birthday party, and we hadn't seen each other in years. He has been reputed, I've heard him say, that was one of the most interesting years of his life with this group. And you notice he played very differently from what he does on any other music I've ever heard him do. And when he saw me, he threw his arms around me and said, "Let's do that again, man." I said, "Hank, I'm not doing it anymore." But it was a great, nice feeling. He's a nice guy and a hell of a player. One great musician.
I'm going to say two words, and I want your response. The blues.
What about the blues? Well, the blues is, that's part of the whole thing. The 12-bar blues, most people don't even know what that is, the average non-jazz player. It's 12-bar form. You play a 4-bar phrase, you repeat it more or less, and then you play a summation of it in the last 4. So it's a 12-bar phrase, as far as I know, original in jazz. No other country has ever come up, or no other culture has ever come up with it. And it is the basis. Well, a tune like, say, Summit Ridge Drive is the blues in C. The sad sack is the blues. The blues is all over the place. Without it, I don't think jazz would have the same form it has. It's like saying Louis Armstrong made jazz. Well, he didn't make it, but without him, it would sure have a different face.
Mm-hmm.
And the same applies to the few innovators. I did things, for example, that I can feel pretty good about. I introduced strings to jazz. No one had seriously thought of using a string section in a jazz band up until then. And I tried it first in an experiment, which turned out to be an enormous hit, a tune called Freddie, which I didn't like at all as a record, but I liked the idea that you could use legitimate so-called instrumentation in the context of a jazz band and fuse them so they would work, each doing its own thing. And I hired William Grant Still. Now, we also did Bill Still's blues from Lenox Avenue with a big band. But you feel good about having done something that hadn't been done before. Mm-hmm. The same thing with the harpsichord for the original Gramercy 5.
Johnny Garnieri.
Yeah, well, it wasn't Johnny. It was my idea to get a harpsichord. And then Johnny had to learn to play it because you can't do percussive things. It's a plucked instrument, you know?
Right.
But anyway, he made it sound pretty good. And it worked. But then I got tired of it. It's limited.
Right.
So I went back to the next Gramercy 5, which with Dodo Marmarosa and Roy Eldridge and Barney Kessel, and then this last Gramercy 5, again with piano. Piano is a more, what's the word, you can do diversified things with it that you can't do on a harpsichord.
Especially with Hank Jones behind the
Well, Hank, as I say, I got him because I was delighted to be able to get him for this group. I put the group together because the IRS was dunning me and had to go out and make some money, but rather than go out and get bored, I got the best man I could find. So I had a little fun with it.
Artie Shaw joins us here on KPCC FM 89.3. I'm Freddie Johnson. Artie, you mentioned Summit Ridge Drive, and you had a message there. We had a caller. Somebody needed to know desperately how you came about that title.
I'll read her message. She said, "Did you write your hit Summit Ridge Drive while you were living in Hollywood, or was it the Summit Ridge Drive in Glendale?" Well, in the first place, I didn't know there was a Summit Ridge Drive in Glendale. But I was living in Summit Ridge Drive, on Summit Ridge Drive, 2127 to be exact. I still remember the address. And when we rehearsed the tune for a recording date, this was among 4 other pieces, with 3 other pieces. That was the first one we rehearsed, and we started with the blues and C's, and I played a riff, and the rest of the guys got with it. And I had that little harpsichord up there, and we rehearsed it. We liked it well enough to go into the studio and record it, and I didn't have a name for the tune. But when it was finished and the A&R man asked what we should call it, I should call it Summit Ridge Drive. I had no idea it was going to become a hit. Mm-hmm. And oddly enough, on its first release, in those days, I was a big record seller, and that sold its normal 300,000 copies. after World War II, when I came back, somebody had the idea of re-releasing that for some reason, and this time it went through the ceiling. It's one of my gold records, meaning it sold over 1 million. This has sold, maybe 5 or 6 million by now.
Right.
Still going strong.
Now, you led a band in the Navy back in, 43, something like that?
Yeah, I got into the Navy right after it started. I was in Providence, Rhode Island, when the Pearl Harbor incident took place, and when I heard it, everything seemed to pale into insignificance, and I had to go back out on stage and announce Stardust or something, and it sounded so fatuous. Mm-hmm. Here we were in the middle of a conflagration. So on impulse, I went to the front row of the band where Les Robinson, first album man, was sitting, and I said, "Pass the word, this is 2 weeks' notice."
Oh,
and
really?
It went through the band, and we played the rest of that show was with a pall over it. Anyway, I joined the Navy a couple of months later,
mm-hmm.
and went all over the country with a band. They thought it was a good idea for me to put a band together. I saw Forrester, Lou, then Secretary of the Navy, and asked him what I could do. And he said, "The best thing you do is put together a band." I said, "Where's the Navy?" He said, "South Pacific." I said, "Okay, let's go there." And we did.
What was that like for you?
It was a disastrous time. It was a nightmare in my life. I don't even like to think back on it, because it was, war is war. It's probably the most lunatic thing mankind can engage in, and so it's kind of futile to look for sense in it. I did at one point and had a nervous breakdown,
mm-hmm.
and I was picked up by a psychiatrist wandering around in a daze, and he put me into a quintet, isolated me, so I could get away from the mobs of people who were driving me nuts.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point he said, "The trouble with you is you're trying to make sense out of this. You're in a war. There is no sense. Don't look for it, and you won't be disappointed." I remembered that, and it worked. It got me back into gear again, and I was able to go through the rest of that Navy tour.
Now, besides having a band with strings, also the band within the band concept, Gramercy 5. Why did you do that? Was that a financial thing, or did you just...
No. That had to do with the fact that I was trying, after I made that experiment, it's called Frenesy, which led to putting together a real band with Billy Butterfield on first trumpet and Jack Jenny on trombone, and a very fine orchestra. Probably the best band I ever had, and we were able to play anything from classical or serious music on to jazz, which is also serious. But we made records like I Cover the Waterfront and Moonglow, and those still hold up. They're as good as anything. A record called, for example, Chantez les Bas, which is a marvelous record. St. James Infirmary.
Didn't Kid Ory do that?
Pardon me?
Chantez les Bas, Edward Kid Ory?
But we did things to it that he hadn't done, just like the Lenox Avenue Blues we did. Weren't in his writing. We did part of what he wrote and went off our own way. But anyway, the point I'm making is that that band allowed you to do it like a painter having a lot of colors on his palette, who has usually been painting black and white. It gives you an awful lot of leeway, but it also is constricting. You can't play much straight-ahead jazz within a context of, 18 or, 40 men. So I decided to make some small groups. We had a Chelsea 3. They were named after New York telephone exchanges. The Chelsea 3, the Circle 5, the Butterfield 8, and the Trafalgar 7, and we finally got the Gramercy 5, which was a phone exchange.
Yeah.
And that was the one we made that Summit Ridge Drive with, and since that was a hit, we continued using the Gramercy 5 to this day.
I'm curious, do you ever write any poetry?
Do I what?
Write poetry?
Not any more than I can help. In my book, I've got a couple of examples of what the central character in my book, is doing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of poetry. I'm not a big reader of poetry, although, Wordsworth and Wallace Stevens and a few of those people are part of my lexicon. Mm-hmm. Or Philip Larkin or Auden. And there I do read some.
Mm-hmm. We're going to hear music now, and we'll be back with Artie Shaw. We're going to hear Frenesy.
Oh, please. The new one?
Yeah.
Oh, that's okay. I can stand that one.
Artie Shaw with Frenesy on KPCC. Freddie from Artie Shaw. Artie, that's your preferred version, isn't it?
Well, it's a different version by far. The other one, was done, as I said, as an experiment, and oddly enough, it took off like a singed cat. It's been following me around ever since. It made an awful lot of money. Sold, millions. I think it's my second or third biggest record in terms of money.
Mm-hmm.
One was Begin, and number two, I think, was either Freddie or Stardust, or vice versa. So, I can't complain about it, but it wasn't what I wanted to do music. It was a studio band. It's an experiment to see if that would work, out of which came a very good band.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people think it's the best band I've had, the one with the strings.
Right. We're joined by Artie Shaw this morning, the King of the Clarinet. Also, that led to your collaborations with Paul Jordan back in 41, didn't it?
Yeah, well, it wasn't so much a collaboration. Paul actually wrote his own things. I did write the introduction for Evensong. It wasn't quite long enough for a 12-inch record, so it needed that. And I wrote that introduction, and I did some changing on Suite number 8, a few things like that. But he was a very good writer. He did a marvelous record, very underrated, of mine, called 2-in-1 Blues and Hindustan. I thought were excellent records. Made the band sound very different.
What do you think about music in general in 1994? Be kind.
Of which 1994?
Yeah, what do you think of the music world these days?
Today?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I think as little about it as possible. And most of it is redundant. I hear an awful lot of stuff that makes me wish the LP or CD had never been invented. There are guys playing choruses who have played choruses of 15 choruses when one said it all. It's too much. It's really getting to be too much. I think jazz has painted itself into a corner. I can't see much future for it unless somebody comes along and gives it a revolutionary turn in some other direction.
That's you.
Well, I'm not going to do it again. I've done my share. People want to hear me, they got to go back 45 years and listen to these records. They're the best I'll ever do. Of course, if you'd stayed in it longer, I'd have probably played myself right out of an audience, as many composers and writers have.
Mm-hmm.
There's an inverse ratio. The better you are, the less people understand you. It's understandable because stop to think about it. I don't know very much about shoemaking. So if it's a really great shoemaker, I don't know why he should charge $400 for a pair of shoes when I can buy shoes for $60 or $70. But there must be a reason. And the same way with my music. If it's very, very good musically, I can't expect the average non-specialized listener to understand what I was doing. Some of these records that we're playing right now will bear about 8 listenings before you'll really begin to hear what's going on. So, that's true of any good music. If you listen to, after all, who cares what happened in the world when the Hofner Symphony was being written by Mozart? The Hofner is still around.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever generals were making, whatever noises and splashes they were, I don't care. Nobody else, the world doesn't care. Those are ephemeral. The music is forever.
Besides writing, what are you up to these days?
But besides what?
Writing. What do you get into?
Oh, the rest of it is I see friends and we talk. I like good conversation, but I don't have too much of it. I'd say I'm very blessed. I think I have about 6 people in the world that I can really unburden to, who can unburden to me.
Mm-hmm.
A man I know he's got a new heart. He's been 6 years with a new heart. He's a dead man on the paper. He's alive, and we're great friends. He comes to see me occasionally. He was the editor of the op-ed page of a paper in Dallas, the good paper, and he wrote me a letter recently that I'm going to frame about myself. Just the most touching letter I've ever received about how he feels and how he thinks the world feels about me. I wouldn't presume to quote it, but I want the letter. It's marvelous.
Mm-hmm.
So, it happens, and there are people that I know that I can talk to. Laura Huxley, Aldous' widow. I just wrote an introduction for a book of hers that's being reprinted called You Are Not the Target. And I keep pretty busy. I see people. As the rest of it, I've learned there's a big difference between loneliness and solitude. I welcome solitude. Nothing ever really good gets done by a committee. That's the trouble with government. Too many committees. On the other hand, they're governing too many people. And, how can you find something that's going to please everybody? When you decide you want to be president, you have to make up your mind that you're going to be loathed by 49% of the population. the way it goes. And you got to be kind of a pretty strange guy to want that hot seat.
Right. Boy. Artie, the time has flown by. I know you probably have to get back on the road here. It's been an hour and a half of...
Has it been that long?
It has indeed.
Well, it sure moved, didn't it?
It sure did.
You're a good questioner. You're a good DJ. Most people don't know what what they're talking about or what you're talking about.
No, I appreciate it. We enjoy your music tremendously and invite you to come back anytime, really.
Thank you, Freddie. I'll do it when I get get this book finished. I'll come back.
You're very welcome. Please.
Bore you to death with reading parts of it.
Artie, thanks again for stopping by, and the best of luck to you this year.
Thank you, Freddie. I appreciated the opportunity to talk to the audience and to you.
Thank you, Artie. Artie Shaw on FM 89.3 KPCC, Pasadena, Los Angeles, Orange County, the home of classic American music from the King of the Clarinet. Here he is.